This is the final step in the Fast Track strategy model stream. Again, Fast Track is trying to show you the fastest way possible to build a strategy model for your organization. The weighting exercise is perhaps the most complicated step, but many of our clients have told us it's by far the most exciting meeting they have all year long. Why? Because in this meeting, they will have the chance to have a risk-free conversation about their beliefs about strategic priorities. What's interesting about that is normally a conversation about strategy is backed up by some crisis in the organization, operational issue or product issue that causes our priorities to be skewed around solving the problem. This also allows you to reveal individuals' agendas and begin working towards gaining alignment across the people. So the steps are pretty straightforward. First, what you need to do is weight the 4 perspectives. We're going to say this is 100% of your strategy, represented on the strategy map. Allocate 100% across the 4 perspectives. The second step is, now that we've agreed on the weighting for each perspective, we're going to allocate the weighting within that perspective across its strategic objectives. I'll show you how. But first, you need to understand 4 simple guidelines that you need to emphasize with your team. First, the weighting or emphasis doesn't mean people or money or even the managerial time and focus you spend on an issue. It's a combination of those things, which means if an objective comes up with a 5% weighting, we don't expect it to have 5% of the people or an investment of 5% of your funds. It certainly should not be, say, 50 or 60%, but it could be, in the range of 5, 10, 15% would still be okay. Secondly, the weighting is for the overall business unit that you're strategy modeling, not for your department. So it's important that you take off your functional hat and represent the interests of the overall team during this conversation. Thirdly, in this exercise, we're going to be weighting the strategy model for the next 12 months. Obviously, if you're going to weight it for, say, 5 years out, we'll have a different weighting. In fact, you might want to do that as an interesting alternative exercise. But for now, agree on the time frame you're weighting it for. And most importantly, the leader of that part of the organization has veto power. They have final say in what the weightings will be. So we're going to use the example of a public utility distribution organization. So let's go through the steps. First, we have to consider the 4 perspectives and allocate the weighting. So we're going to take your strategy map that you've built in the spreadsheet and add some columns off to the right, one for each of the leadership members that are going to be in the organization. Then you're going to remind them of the 4 guidelines, and then you might want to give them a little bit more information, which would be this. Typically, the internal and enabler perspectives are what we call value building. That's where I'm building great processes or great people. The customer and financial perspectives are value consuming. We're going to translate the great processes and great people into either happy stakeholders or customers or happy accountants and investors. So early in an organization, the weighting is typically higher on the enablers and internal. And as the product or company matures, the weighting shifts to customer and eventually to financial. So you might want to consider reminding and having the leader give the team a conversation about strategic intent and where the organization is. Then each person is asked to, on a piece of paper, write down what they think the weightings are. And what you're going to do is key them in one at a time. So in this case, this individual had a weighting of 20% for stakeholders, 30% for internal, 40% for catalysts, and 10% for financial. And if we add on the rest of the leadership team, we can begin to see what their scores are, and we add it in a column that calculates the average. Now, when you begin facilitating the conversation, what we typically do is ask those who have the highest weighting and lowest weighting on any perspective to help explain their thinking. So in this case, the range goes as low as 10% and as high as 30%. In the next perspective, let's see, we have a 40% and it seems to go as low as 25%. And so forth. So at each level, we want people to have that conversation. It's important to note that everyone should have a fair say if they feel necessary. Personally, I don't try to call people out on it, but the net is they may know one piece of information that would influence the overall team, and so you need to make sure everyone has their voice. What I also do is I typically have the leader of the group go last. I don't want people to skew their score based on what the leader has put forward. Now, ultimately, you need the team to work towards an agreement on what the weighting looks like, and often that will happen on its own. But if you can't get that resolution, ultimately ask the leader to make a recommendation, because ultimately it's their job to make sure they get the priorities right. And of course, if they don't get them right, they're the ones that get fired. So in this case, when the team looked at it, they came up with a score of 20, 30, 40, and 10. Now, it's important to note that as soon as you reach that agreement, I always delete all the other scores, because now it's done. We have the agreement. It's now 20, 30, 40, 10. It doesn't matter what you thought it was before. We now all agree that's what it is. And then we're going to go on to the second step, which is going through each of the perspectives. So, for example, on the first perspective, we have 20% to allocate, and each of the team members, not necessarily in the same order, can put their score up. And again, you're going to facilitate a conversation to reach a level of agreement. And typically, same thing. What are the highest and lowest scores? What was your thinking? And so forth. Eventually, the team's going to come to a decision on that perspective and the next, and so forth. Now, the idea here is that as soon as they reach agreement, delete those scores so that that's off the table, and it's not ever... you're not ever able to go back and retrace those things, because the agreement now is as follows. The other issue you have is you can see when you have too many objectives. In this case, we have 5 objectives on the enabler, or they called it catalyst perspective. The weightings end up being pretty low. And so it becomes pretty hard to weight a strategy map that has too many objectives on it. That said, most strategy maps have too many to begin with. Eventually, they get simpler over a couple of years. So in this case, this is what their strategy map looks like as shown in PowerPoint. Now when you put the weightings on it, you begin to see that there are a number of objectives which are clearly more important. So in this case, their core strategy is about leveraging technology, attracting and retaining great people so that they can pursue operational excellence, ensure their longer-term energy portfolios in place in order to correctly connect customers and build a brand. So this allows us to begin doing some of the other steps that you'll learn about, such as putting scorecard metrics where it's appropriate, begin linking process and projects and so forth. But we have clear now agreement about our strategic priorities over the next 12 years. The process I've described, you might want to repeat once a quarter just to keep it fresh and make sure that we're tracking with those day-to-day changes that occur that you don't actually notice. Of course, you can also go through this weighting exercise when you have systemic events in your environment or your business. So if we went back to one of the examples we've been using before with the bank or manufacturing organization, this is where their weighting might have ended up. And you can see in this case, if I look at all the weightings over 10%, their strategy is about strategically using technology in order to build great relationships so that we can support our innovation activities in aid ultimately of building our brand. So it's a very internal innovation focused strategy in this particular period of time, and that helps everyone get aligned in their activities.